about. Richard Nixon bequeathed us the so-called core inflation measure, which strips out food and fuel, which, as Barry Ritholtz says, is like reporting inflation ex inflation. While it was Bill Clinton who left us with the current tangled statistical morass that is now our official method of measuring inflation. At every turn, a new way of measuring and reporting was derived that invariably served to make things seem a bit rosier than they actually were. So let's begin with inflation, which is reported to us by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, in the form of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If you were to measure inflation, you'd probably track the cost of a basket of goods from one year to the next, subtract the two, and measure the difference. And your method would in fact be the way inflation was officially measured right on up through the early 1980s. But in 1996, Clinton implemented the Boskin Commission findings, which now have us measuring inflation using these three oddities: substitution, weighting, and hedonics. To begin on this list, we no longer simply measure the cost of goods and services from one year to the next because of something called the substitution effect. Thanks to the Boskin Commission, it is now assumed that when the price of something rises, people will switch to something cheaper. So anytime, say, that the price of salmon goes up too much, it is removed from the basket of goods and substituted with something cheaper like hot dogs. By this methodology, the BLS says that food costs rose 4.1% from 2007 to 2008. However, according to the Farm Bureau, which does not do this and simply tracks the exact same shopping basket of 30 goods from one year to the next, food prices rose 11.3% over the past year, compared to the BLS, who say that they only rose 4.1%. Now that's a huge difference. One impact of using substitution is that our measure of inflation no longer measures the cost of living, but the cost of survival. Next, anything that rises too quickly in price is now subjected to so-called geometric weighting, in which goods and services that are rising most rapidly in price get a lower weighting in this CPI basket, under the assumption that people will use less of those things. Using the government's own statistics from two different sources, we find that healthcare is about 17% of our total economy, but it is only weighted as 6% of the CPI basket. Because healthcare costs are rising extremely rapidly, the impact of including a much smaller healthcare weighting is a reduction in reported inflation. By simply reinstating the actual level of healthcare spending, our reported CPI would be several percent higher. But the most outlandish adjustment of them all goes by the name hedonics, the Greek root of which means for the pleasure of. This adjustment is supposed to adjust for quality improvements, especially those that lead to greater enjoyment or utility of the product, but it has been badly overused. Here's an example. Tim LaFleur is a commodity specialist for televisions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where the CPI is calculated. I'm guessing he works in a place that looks like this. In 2004, he noted that a 27-inch television selling for $329.99 was selling for the same price last year, but was now equipped with a better screen. After taking this subjective improvement into account, he adjusted the price of the TV downwards by $135, concluding that the screen improvement was the same as if the price of the TV had fallen by 29%. The price reflected in the CPI was not the actual retail store cost of $329.99, which is what it would cost you to buy, but $195. Bingo! At the BLS, TVs now cost less and inflation is heading down. At the store, they're still selling for $329.99. And hedonics are a one-way trip. If I get a new phone this year and it has some new buttons, the BLS will say that the price has dropped. But if this new phone only lasts 8 months instead of 30 years like my old phone, no adjustment will be made for that loss. In short, hedonics rests on the improbable assumption that new features are always beneficial and are synonymous with falling prices. Over the years, the BLS has expanded the use of hedonic adjustments and now applies them to everything from TVs to automobiles, washers, dryers, refrigerators, and even to college textbooks. Hedonics are now used to adjust as much as 46% of the total CPI. The social cost to this self-deception is enormous. For starters, if inflation were calculated like it used to be, Social Security payments, whose increases are based on the CPI, would be 70% larger than today. Here's an example, though, of how far from reality GDP has strayed. The reported number for 2003 was a GDP of $11 trillion, implying that 11 trillion of money-based, value-added economic transactions had occurred. However, nothing of the sort happened. First, that $11 trillion included $1.6 trillion of imputations, where it was assumed that economic value had been created, but no actual transactions took place. The largest of these imputations was the value that the owner of a house receives by not having to pay themselves rent. Did you follow that? If you own your house, the government adds how much they think you should have been paying yourself in rent to live there and adds that amount to the GDP. Another is the benefit that you receive from the free checking provided by your bank, which is imputed to have a value because if it weren't free, then you'd have to pay for it. So that value is guesstimated and added to the GDP as well. Together, just these two imputations add up to over $1 trillion of our reported GDP. Next, the GDP has many elements that are hedonically adjusted. For instance, computers are hedonically adjusted to account for the idea that because they are faster and more feature-rich than in past years, they must be contributing more to our economic output than their price alone would indicate. So if a $1,000 computer were sold, it would be recorded as contributing more than $1,000 to the GDP. Of course, that extra money is fictitious in the sense that it never traded hands and it doesn't exist. What's interesting is that for the purposes of inflation measurements, hedonic adjustments are used to reduce the apparent price of computers, but for GDP calculations, hedonic adjustments are used to boost their apparent price. Hedonics, therefore, are used to maneuver prices higher or lower, depending on which outcome makes things look more favorable. So, what were the total hedonic adjustments in 2003? An additional whopping $2.3 trillion. Taken together, these mean that $3.9 trillion, or fully 35% of our reported GDP, was not based on transactions that you could witness, record, or touch.